All right, well, even though this is a little awkward, I think I'm going to start the introduction now. Hopefully the people who are still finishing up their dinner can still hear me, even if they can't see me. But I am mindful of our speaker's time, and I don't want to extend it longer than I said we would. So welcome, and thank you for joining us for our first Thursday night out of the season. For those who do not know me, my name is Nicholas Cassis, and I'm an associate rector here at Trinity-by-the-Cove. Tonight, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Jeffrey Bilbro, who is joining us via the marvels of modern technology from Pennsylvania. Dr. Bilbro is an associate professor of English at Grove City College. He grew up in the mountainous state of Washington, earned his BA in writing and literature from George Fox University in Oregon, and his PhD in English from Baylor University. His books include Words for Conviviality, Media Technologies and Practices of Hope, Loving God's Wildness, The Christian Roots of the Ecological Ethics in American Literature, Wendell Berry and Higher Education, Cultivating Virtues of Place, Virtues of Renewal, Wendell Berry's Sustainable Forms, and Reading the Times, a literary and theological inquiry into the news, which is the subject of his talk tonight, and a few copies of which are available for purchase from the table at the back of the room. Dr. Bilbro has written much on how we as Christians might live more faithfully in the midst of a whole host of modern technological advances and media, and we are so thankful that he has agreed to be with us tonight. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Alex Vance, Rusty Troth, and Bruce McKever, who are on the committee that organizes this speaker series and who helped to arrange for Dr. Bilbro to be with us tonight. I should also say that we will be recording this talk, and we'll make it available on our website after the event for those who either couldn't make it tonight or who want to revisit the talk at a later time. Dr. Bilbro has graciously agreed to take some questions at the end of his presentation, so if you think of a question during the talk, maybe jot it down, and maybe you brought a napkin from across the way, jot it down on the napkin, and we'll get to it before the night's over. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeffrey Bilbro. Uh-oh, I think you're muted.
How's that?
Perfect.
A little better? Well, thank you. As I was saying, I'm really grateful to be here with you all, and so thanks for this invitation. I know this is kind of a crazy week with the election week, so maybe this is a particularly apt topic to think about ways in which we can read the news that are helpful and ways that are more distracting or overwhelming or distorting to our efforts to love God and love our neighbor. So yeah, I'll try to work through a few sort of ideas, and then hopefully we can have some dialogue or some questions. But the first thing I wanted to just begin with is maybe a caveat about what I'm not going to do. Sometimes when people find out that I've written books about the news or about media ecology, they want me to have, they hope that I might have some very clear, tangible takeaway, like which outlet can I trust? Or isn't it the case that Fox News or MSNBC or New York Times or, this particular source is the real problem? And if people would just not listen to that, then we'd be okay. Or what about social media? So I think these are all fair questions. But as you'll see tonight, I think in many ways the extent of the underlying challenges we face means that we can't answer them easily or in isolation. So the reality of the news is complicated, it's messy, and rather than pretend to give you an easy answer, I'm going to try to explore two disorders in our own hearts as readers and as neighbors. Disorders that I think often shape the posture, our posture toward the news, and then consider just briefly two ways that we might address these disorders at their root rather than their symptoms. And I think as Christians, we shouldn't be surprised that sin and its consequences would deform the means that we have to better understand and love our neighbors, right? We should expect this to be the case, but we should also have confidence that Christ's redemptive work can enable us to be his ministers of reconciliation. So I want to begin tonight, just sort of lay the table for you by assessing the validity of two different assumptions that you might have about the effects of the news media. And the first is that you might think people who follow the news more closely, people who read and watch more, are more involved in their communities. I think this seems intuitive, right? It makes sense that people who attend more to the news are then more involved in society or the neighborhood. But this, depending on how you measure it, this is actually, in fact, not the case. This is how political scientist Etienne Hirsch summarizes some findings that he did in a recent study. He says, many college-educated people in particular think they are deeply engaged in politics. They follow the news and debate the latest developments on social media. They might sign an online petition or throw a $5 online donation at a presidential candidate, but mostly they consume political information as a way of satisfying their own emotional and intellectual needs. These people are political hobbyists, and what they are doing is no closer to engaging in politics than watching SportsCenter is to playing football. I think that's a really helpful analogy between following the news and following sports. I'm in just north of Pittsburgh, and when I watch the Pittsburgh Pirates play baseball, I'm under no illusion that my fandom affects the outcome of the game. Even if I'm emotionally invested, which is actually very hard to do because the Pirates are terrible, I know that fundamentally I am just a consumer of an entertaining contest, right? But today's news media, I think, encourages us to consume political or social content in this same way, right, as passive consumers. And concomitantly, it also encourages us to think that we're somehow involved by doing so. I won't go all into this, but I think Hirsch is right when he goes on and argues that actually being a political hobbyist is not just unhelpful, but it's actually negative, right? Because it redirects political energy that we might otherwise invest in more efficacious ways. And then it also rewards politicians and sort of influencers who spend their energy playing the news media cycle rather than actually addressing problems or trying to pass legislation. One more point from Hirsch. He does a survey in which he sort of asks people, how much do you actually do sort of politically broadly construed? And he said he finds that those in particular who are college educated report that they spend more time on politics, but less than 2% of that time involves volunteering in political organizations. And he defines political quite broadly, actually. You might say civic. But the rest is spent mostly on news consumption, discussion and debate, and contemplating politics alone. 10% of the time is unclassifiable, right? So we can spend a lot of time and energy thinking about politics, or being very emotionally invested. But if that's not translating to any sort of action or even prayer, then it's maybe not particularly helpful. At the end of this part of his book, he concludes that the majority of people who report following the news on a daily basis report belonging to 0 organizations, having attended 0 political meetings in the past year, and having worked 0 times to solve a particular problem with others in their community. So again, I think there's multiple dynamics going on here, but maybe one sort of aside I would just make is I think part of the problem is that the news we have available to us is most often focused on national or international issues where it's really hard to get involved, right? And fewer local issues where we might have more occasion. So that's certainly part of the problem. But again, the point that Hirsch is making, I think, is that the feeling of being involved, the feeling of following the news, watching breathlessly as the political election unfolds, is not in fact the same as actually being involved. Just like following your favorite sports team is not the same as playing the sport. And we need to, not make that category, not confuse those two categories. Okay, so that's the first assumption. People who follow the news closely must be more involved, right? I'm suggesting maybe not. Second, this seems like even lower hanging fruit. We might think that people who follow the news more closely must at least have a better understanding of political or social or cultural issues, right? But again, I'm going to say not really. So the data I'm going to show you here is from a 2019 survey done by More in Common, kind of nonpartisan effort to combat polarization in America. So maybe things have changed in the last 5 years, but I doubt it. But they conducted a sort of year-long set of surveys, quite in depth, and they discovered this perception gap where people on the extremes, you can see in this slide, people on the extremes of the political spectrum badly misidentify the political or social views of their opponents. Which again, this is not super surprising, right? We may expect that if you're, really progressive or really conservative, then you might view the opposite side as you're sort of, based on the worst version of them. But I think more surprisingly, they find that this perception gap also holds for people who are following the news, and in fact, politically disengaged people who follow the news hardly at all, as you can see here, are less wrong, right? They are much better at answering questions about the views of their opponents and just the reality of the situation in politics or culture than those who follow the news some of the time or most of the time. This is how they explain these findings. You might think that people who regularly read the news are more informed about their political opponents, but in fact, the opposite is the case. We found that the more news people consumed, the larger their perception gap. People who said they read the news most of the time were nearly 3 times more distorted in their perceptions than those who said they read the news only now and then. We can't prove that one causes the other, but these results suggest that rather than making Americans better informed, media coverage is now feeding our misperceptions. One more slide from their survey. They do find that not all news sources are created equal. So as you might guess, news outlets with a stronger partisan identity, people who that's their primary source, they tend to have the worst perception gap. But again, you can see none of the above, right? People who just don't get their news are actually doing better than pretty much any source except for broadcast TV, which is kind of surprising to me because I don't watch TV. Maybe I should. But I think it's helpful to recognize there's a spectrum here. But again, the takeaway, I think, is the more time you spend reading the news, it seems, the less accurate your perceptions are of the political and social landscape, which is kind of depressing. One columnist in the National Review responds to this study. He writes, "How could it possibly be that the more you pay attention to political media, the less likely you are to understand the true beliefs of your political opponents?" So why might this be, right? If people who follow the news most closely do less and even know less than people who simply don't follow the news, something seems wrong, right? The media seems to not be doing its stated purpose, right? Helping us know what's going on around us and guiding our actions in the world. And I want to suggest that maybe the sort of underlying problems here, we can certainly talk about, issues with the media itself, the kind of supply side, but I want to turn to the demand side, right? What is it in our hearts, in our actions as consumers that rewards sort of kinds of media that don't inform us and don't guide our actions? I want to say that quite often, the media that we have both caters to and cultivates a bored and a lonely audience. I think all too often we, as consumers, turn to the media not to understand our neighbors and our world, but out of a kind of acedia or boredom, a kind of slothful unwillingness to engage in the difficult work of knowing and understanding and loving our neighbors. And then the sort of superficial news reports might scratch our restless itch for some novelty, but they leave us feeling disconnected, anxious, and lonely. They leave us isolated. So if the news media should be helping us know and love our neighbors, it most often, I think, leaves us just as bored and lonely as they were in the first place. So I'm going to reflect a little bit on these two in turn. First, being bored and being lonely, try to figure out what's going on, and then I'll conclude with maybe two alternatives, two ways to try to break this cycle. But I want to look at the first one, this one about boredom, with a quotation from Henry David Thoreau's essay, Life Without Principle, which is kind of an essay he writes as a sequel to Walden, his big book. And you might think Thoreau, this is 160 years ago, what does he have to say? But Thoreau is actually responding to the burgeoning mass media of his day and the first digital technology, the telegraph, that is making sort of what we think of as the modern news industry. And he compares attending to the daily news with eating too much junk food, basically. Both of them give us a kind of bellyache. This is what he says. We should treat our minds, that is ourselves, as innocent and ingenious children whose guardians we are, and be careful what objects and what subjects we thrust on their attention. Read not the times, read the eternities. Those things which now most engage the attention of men as politics and the daily routine are, it is true, vital functions of human society, but should be unconsciously performed like the corresponding functions of the physical body. Not only individuals, but states have thus a confirmed dyspepsia, or a confirmed kind of indigestion, right? Just like when you eat too much junk food, you feel sick. So when you eat too much intellectual media junk food, you have this kind of bloated intellectual discomfort. And yet in both cases, quite often, right, it doesn't really satisfy our hunger, and so we're still hungry for more, right? We keep going back to these sources, even though they don't really satisfy. I think Thoreau is right, too, when he points out that this is not just an individual problem, right? Even states can have this kind of communal indigestion. The politics in America in the age of social media is good evidence for his claim here. You might think too, right, that part of the problem is that the news becomes, in this context, just one more product competing for our attention. So if I'm bored, I could binge a Netflix show, right, another kind of food metaphor of unhealthy eating. Or I could just scroll through a news feed or scroll through the front page of some online website, some news website. And these are kind of parallel activities, right? They're both amusements, right? Not thinking. They're designed to not require thought from us, but to just entertain bored consumers. And so when we attend to the news in this fashion, then we become susceptible to the latest groupthink, to whatever kind of jargon or talking points or hashtags might be going viral, right? We become pretty passive recipients, and we just take in the events around us through the prepackaged categories that are provided for us. But hashtags and slogans, memes, these lack the precision and the nuance that are required to do justice to the complexity of our world and its events. So if the only resources, the tools we have come from the sort of bored craving for entertainment, then I think this is how it comes to be, that we can follow the news really closely, but actually be less informed of what's going on in our communities. And I think it's interesting, too, that when we habitually attend to distant news, it's not just our minds that are damaged, it's also our sort of emotional or psychological faculties, right? We become less able to feel and act responsibly. In Walden, Thoreau has a great image, I think, where he's describing this problem by critiquing the recent boom in philanthropic activity. He says there are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. And it may be that he who bestows the largest amount of time and money on the needy is doing the most by his very mode of life to produce that misery, which he strives in vain to relieve, right? So we think we're helping the problem, or trying to address the problem, but we're just perpetuating it. To give you another analogy, about the same time that Thoreau is writing this, Charles Dickens is penning a novel, Bleak House. And there's a character in Bleak House, Mrs. Jellyby, who Dickens calls a telescopic philanthropist, And she is very concerned about orphans in Africa. And so she spends all of her time trying to help the orphans in Africa. Dickens is not quite convinced that she's actually doing much good over there. But what's quite clear in the novel is that those who are suffering the most from this are her own children. She utterly neglects her children. Somebody else has to take care of them because she is so fixated on somebody far away. So it's not that we should not care about others far away, but it's that the objects on our screen can seem more important than the people in the room with us, the people nearby. And our sort of affectional sensibilities become distorted and out of whack. I think when our experience of the world is filtered through the screen or the news media, we risk being like the priest and the Levite who passed by the wounded man on the side of the road, thinking, I have more important work to do. I have more important things to do. And we're less likely to be like the Samaritan who sees the wounded man, who has compassion on him, and then who takes action to actually help his neighbor. So, boredom, right? If we turn to the news out of this kind of boredom, we're going to crave outrage or sensationalism or drama, rather than the more messy, difficult, complicated information that might help us actually understand the world and then discern how we might be called to act redemptively in it. Okay, so I'll come back to that in a minute, but I want to talk a little bit here about loneliness and the problem of loneliness, and then turn to solutions or remedies. I won't be so bold. Loneliness. So I think if the consequences of turning to the news in search of amusement are bad, the effects of looking here for community are no better. The news media can offer us a sense of community, right? Everybody else is watching the election returns come in. So we feel like we're part of some community, or everyone else is attending to the drama of the war in Ukraine or what's happening in the Middle East. Or on a more trivial level, what's happening with the local sports team. So shared attention can give us this sense that we're part of a broader community. Benedict Anderson describes this in his book. He's talking about sort of early newspapers and how they helped form different communities. He says each communicant, each sort of reader of the newspaper is well aware that the ceremony he performs is being replicated simultaneously by thousands or millions of others of whose existence he is confident, yet of whose identity he has not the slightest notion. Furthermore, the ceremony is incessantly repeated at daily or half-daily intervals throughout the calendar. And of course, for us with smartphones, right, it's as often as we want. What more vivid figure for the secular, historically clocked, imagined community can be envisioned, right, than this news consumer? And I think in particular, it's other forms of communities, other forms of belonging, right? Whether it's civic society or family life, the church, your neighborhood. As these other institutions weaken, which they have over the last decades in America, then the offer of community held out by the media becomes increasingly attractive, right? Kind of participating in this shared attention to events on our screens because it becomes one of the last opportunities that we have to feel like we're in the know, like we're part of the community, we belong. And as we're more and more embedded in a world of newspapers or TV or social media, we feel like we're part of some, unfolding history, right? One commentator notes that for a certain segment of the population, the news has come to fill up more and more time and more subtly to occupy center stage in our subjective sense of reality. For some of us, at least, screens have altered our way of being in the world, such that the news is no longer one aspect of the backdrop to our lives, but the main drama. I sometimes think that we should have this sort of warning etched into the bottom of our screens, like we do etched into the bottom of our mirrors on our cars. Objects on screen are more distant than they appear. That we sort of put these things in their proper proportion and recognize that this is that the news can really take on this outsized importance in our lives and become the definitive horizon against which we judge the meaning and the value of our daily lives. Right? We can think that performing in some historical drama, I think most recently of the election, right, is where our identity is centered. But as Christians, of course, that's a dangerous false idea. And more than that, I think attending to the news is really an inadequate remedy for loneliness, right? It doesn't satisfy. And this is because shared attention to issues that are happening in the public sphere only forms certain kinds of community, because the mediums through which the news circulate shape the sorts of community that are available. Sherry Turkle has a great book on this and the ways that digital technologies are reshaping community. And the title of her book is Alone Together, right? We're together, but we're alone together. Everyone is on his or her own device, alone, connected. And you have to just observe the behavior of an online mob to get a sense for how digitally connected individuals sort of swarm in response to some stimulus, some news, some image, some gaffe by a politician. And then there's this kind of short-lived, intense, attentional community that forms and then dissipates, right? It's gone. And we reconvene somewhere else. The philosopher Zygmunt Bauman distinguishes these sorts of digital swarms from more traditional forms of community. He says that swarms tend to replace groups which have leaders and hierarchies and pecking orders. And I would add histories, right? Sort of embodied histories. Swarms assemble, disperse, and come together again from one occasion to another, each time guided by different, invariably shifting relevancies and attracted by changing and moving targets. So swarms have no organization, there's no division of labor, there's no we're gonna do something, right? Each individual is just a fungible quantity, right? How many likes can this post get? So when a community is forged through the public sphere, it's a swarm, and it doesn't usually lead to much substantive action or change, and it also doesn't really satisfy people's inbuilt creational need to belong to a body, the body of Christ or a community. A German philosopher writes that the digital swarms just lack the resolve to affect change. Because of their fleeting nature, no political energy wells up. To give you one example of this outside the US context, I think it's helpful. Zainab Tufekci has this book. She's a Turkish author, and she has a book called Twitter and Tear Gas, The Power and Fragility of Networked Protest, in which she describes her experience living through the Arab Spring of the early 2010, 2011, 2012. I think her title sort of captures the basic gist of her argument, which is that digital technologies have great power to connect and mobilize large populations, but any communities they form remain quite fragile and vulnerable, and unable to effect the kind of lasting social or political change that was needed, right? I mean, for a while we thought the word on the street was that Twitter and Facebook were going to save democracy or bring about democracy in the Middle East. And of course, that didn't happen. So again, when we only read about social issues, when our belonging only happens online, then I think we're susceptible to getting caught up in some sort of swarm. Maybe we'll dump ice water on ourselves for the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, or maybe we'll register our outrage over some sort of scandal, some hashtag, or change our profile picture. But will we actually discuss these sorts of issues with our neighbors, or try to redress them in our communities? Unlikely, because that's just not the kind of community that gets formed. One more point on this sort of loneliness problem. Even when we try really hard, I think in healthy ways, to seek out better kinds of community on digital media, again, the sort of thinness of the media usually backfires. So one suggestion that some people make is that it's healthy to diversify your news intake, or to follow people that you disagree with on social media. But in practice, when people try to do this and study it, the findings are that watching your enemy's TV station actually does not broaden your perspective. It actually hardens your own view. One reason for this, and Tafuki talks about this in her book, I think I have, Tafuki observes that people who read the news online actually do encounter a wide variety of opinions, right? We have access to so many different opinions. The problem is not that that we live in this sort of filter bubble. The problem is that we encounter these views in the digital medium. So here's what she says about it. When we encounter opposing views in the age and context of social media, it's not like reading them in a newspaper while sitting alone. Instead, it's like hearing them from the opposing team while sitting with our fellow fans in a football stadium. Online, we're connected with our communities, and we seek approval from our like-minded peers. We bond with our team by yelling at the fans of the other one. In sociology terms, we strengthen our feeling of in-group belonging by increasing our distance from and tension with the out-group, us versus them. Our cognitive universe isn't an echo chamber, but our social one is. And this is why the various projects for fact-checking claims in the news, while valuable, don't convince people. Belonging is stronger than facts. I just think that sort of basic insight that belonging is stronger than facts is why encountering voices in the media that have different ideas than ours doesn't really diversify our communities. It sort of hardens us, right? Just like encountering somebody who roots the wrong sports team. That doesn't really make you question your own loyalties. It hardens them. And again, various studies have backed this up. Chris Bale, who's a sociologist at Duke, ran this series of experiments on the effects of encountering different perspectives on social media. His project had Twitter users follow bots that would retweet voices from the opposite side of the aisle, right? So if you were a sort of lukewarm liberal, then you would follow conservative voices and vice versa. And the result is that those who learned more about the views of the other side actually ended up having their own partisan or ideological commitments strengthened, right? If you started off sort of a centrist lefty or a centrist, righty, by the end of the 6 months, people had gone further because they felt embattled, right? Bale puts it this way. He says, unenthusiastic Democrats and Republicans who followed our bots not only came to identify more strongly with their political party, but they developed new partisan views about issues that they had previously known little about. Bale surmises this is because unenthusiastic partisans do not carefully review new information about politics when they're exposed to opposing voices on social media and then adapt their views accordingly. Instead, they experience stepping outside their echo chamber as an attack upon their identity. I think that's the key, right? That we feel like our community is threatened, right? One person he interviewed says that she felt like there was a war going on and I had to choose a side, right? So it seems that when we see other people talking about politics on the media or social media and then forging their identity based upon these sort of political or ideological or cultural stances, then we think about our identities and communities in terms of these categories as well. And you might be thinking, well, I don't use social media very much. This doesn't really affect me. But I think Mike Sakasis has argued persuasively that in many ways the social media timeline has become sort of the grammar of our world. It's the principal point of mediation now for all of us, certainly to varying degrees, but I think it's hard to escape, right? It's become the sort of pattern of perception, the grammar of all social relations. I'll just give you two examples. If the content of our in-person conversations with people we encounter in our neighborhoods or our churches or our families is drawn from things we see on the social media timeline, then to that extent, I think, our embodied relationships become polarized or become shaped by these categories. And if we assess this sort of state of public discourse based on our reading of social media representations, we tend to give too much weight to the significance of our neighbors' political opinions on a narrow range of hot button issues. And instead of relating to real embodied human persons, we sort of interact with identity categories. I mean, think about it this way. If I meet a new neighbor and I want to strike up a conversation, it would be strange, maybe less strange now, but it would be strange, if the first questions I ask are what he thinks about abortion or immigration or the corporate tax rate. That would be odd, right? We should talk about the weather or fishing or the local high school sports teams. But on social media, because those national issues are all we have in common on the sort of thin stratum of social media, that tends to be how people frame their identities. And so the digital swarms that form on social media not only fail to provide real community, they actually erode the remnants of community life we have left. I think you see this in a lot of churches or civic groups where these sort of national polarized issues impinge upon their discussions and can make it more polarized, more difficult to work together. Okay, so what I've been trying to argue is that the root problem with our media is not out there in some nefarious corporate or political actor. Rather, the root problem is in us, right? It's in our flawed motives and our flawed sinful character that the media voices often appeal to in an effort to keep us engaged and keep scrolling. So if we turn to the media, not in order to understand our neighbors and our world, but out of boredom and out of loneliness, then we will be seeking entertainment. We'll be seeking some sense of belonging. And it's not surprising then that the more we consume the news, the more likely we are to be seeking passive amusement and sort of confirmation of our affiliation with our partisan team. So, if turning to the media exacerbates our loneliness, keeps us in a state of boredom, always seeking some kind of new novelty to scratch our itch, then maybe the best thing we can do is really to step back from the media and to invest our attention and our energy into activities that might help us to better know and love our neighbors. So I think there's a lot here. In my books, I talk about a lot of different ideas, try to draw from a range of voices and ideas. But tonight, I'm just going to suggest two practices and sort of talk you through them real quick. The first is very stereotypical. If I'm an English professor, I teach literature, so you're not going to be surprised to hear me say, maybe we should read more books, essays, or what Marshall McLuhan calls cool media, right? Things that are slow and demand attention from us, and maybe don't give that sort of quick dopamine hit. If you really want to understand a particular political or social issue, I just think it's true that long-form writing is going to serve you much better than the daily news. Bonnie Christian, who's an editor at Christianity Today, she recommends choosing a limited number of stories or issues to follow. Maybe what is God calling you to attend to? And then trying to actually read books and essays about the issue in a kind of substantive fashion. So you're not just flitting from outrage to outrage, but trying to become a student of some issue and then be open to how God might be calling you to deepen your understanding and involvement in it. I think one of the benefits of this approach is that we come to have a greater appreciation of the nuance and complexity of the issue, right? You might still have a very strong conviction about an issue like climate change or racism or the Middle East, but at least you will have a greater understanding of why others hold different opinions, right? You'll have really wrestled with them. And you'll be disabused of the belief, which I think the media proclaims almost daily, that there are easy answers, right? And clear good guys and bad guys. And if you just listen to me, then everything would be better. I like to remember that it was Alexander Solzhenitsyn who spent over a decade in Stalin's gulag. Right? He was somebody who had plenty of reason to think that there is a clear bad guy out there, right? And he writes famously, the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties, but right through every human heart. So on almost no issue can we say, here are the evil people, and if we could just defeat them, all will be well, right? It's always more complicated than that. I think the second benefit of reading books, of consuming slower forms of media, cooler forms of media, is that it shapes you to be a different kind of person, right? You become less bored. Boredom is actually a very modern word. Ennui, boredom, these come about in the 19th century as people have more leisure and don't know what to do with their time. Alan Jacobs makes a related point by way of a passage in a novel called Gravity's Rainbow, where one of the characters is defining temporal bandwidth. The character says, temporal bandwidth is the width of your present, your now. The more you dwell in the past and in the future, the thicker your bandwidth, the more solid your persona. But the narrower your sense of the now, the more tenuous you are. And it may get to where you're having trouble remembering what you were doing 5 minutes ago. Now, if you talk with someone whose intellect and imagination has been formed by social media, you've experienced, right? You can't have a conversation because the person can't sustain a thought, right? It just flits from here to here. You don't want to become that kind of person, right? You want to become a kind of person who's capable of attention, capable of prayer, ultimately, right? So reading old books or breaking bread with the dead is what Jacobs commends for this problem, and I think it's helpful, right? When we internalize wise voices, we're actually thickening our souls and cultivating the capacity to attend more deeply. So that's the boredom one. Read slow stuff. Try to become capable of sustained, complex attention. Second, loneliness. I think, when you feel the ache of loneliness, when you kind of get that itch to belong, to connect with somebody, we could talk with a person, right? We could call up a friend. We could walk over to a neighbor. We could volunteer in a local organization or a church. Maybe even an organization that is trying to respond redemptively in our community to one of the ills, not all of the ills, but one thing that often features in the day's headlines. One of my favorite renditions of this advice is this poem by Richard Wilbur. Wilbur writes this poem in the 1960s, which obviously was a time of real polarization and violence. And Wilbur he himself is sympathetic to the strikers and the protesters, those on the left of the political spectrum, but he is sort of calling out to his own tribe and saying, hey, we need to approach our opponents with charity and patience and dialogue rather than simply shouting them down. So let me just read this poem for you. For the student strikers, go, talk with those who are rumored to be unlike you, and whom it is said you are so unlike. Stand on the stoops of their houses and to tell them why you are out on strike. It is not yet time for the rock, the bullet, the blunt slogan that fuddles the mind toward force. Let a new sound in our streets be the patient sound of your discourse. Doors will be shut in your faces, I do not doubt. Yet here or there, it may be, there will start, much as the lights blink on in a blocked evening, changes of heart. They are your houses. The people are not unlike you. Talk with them then and let it be done, even for the gray wife of your nightmare sheriff and the guardsman's son. So I think this poem is commendable for issuing an invitation. There's a contemporary poet who used to run Social Security, actually, A.M. Juster, and he got serious backlash when he recommended this poem during the 2016 presidential race. But he explains in an essay he wrote then what he finds so moving about Wilbur's words. He says, it's a somber, stately poem, a little sober in its language, but it has a sense of loftiness. 4-line stanzas, and the fourth line is half the length of the other lines. There is both a gentleness and a force to it. I think that's right. There's a gentleness and a force to it, right? because talking to our neighbors with whom we do have much in common, but whom also perhaps we have serious disagreements with, it's going to require both gentleness and force, or sympathy and courage, right? So it may seem trivial to say the problem or the solution to community is to go talk to somebody, but I think we should recognize that this does require character. It's hard, especially to talk to somebody who's maybe different from us in substantive ways. And certainly talking to your neighbor is not going to fix the problems that mark our national media landscape. But I think the benefit is that it might address the root dysfunctions, the sort of root loneliness and passivity, sort of amusement culture that feeds our unhealthy media cycles. And it might be good for your neighbor, right? It might be a blessing to your neighbor as well. So as we try to make sense of our media and figure out how to engage it wisely, I want to just remind you that media simply means that which mediates, right? That which lies between you and your world, you and your neighbors, right? And the question I think we should be asking ourselves is the media that we rely upon to make our neighbors present to us helpful, right? Does it represent them to us, or does it distort and obscure our neighbors? And I think the problem with our current media ecosystem is that all too often its effect is one of distortion rather than one that mediates presence and helps us to know and love others. So recognizing this distortion is the first step towards seeking out more productive means of understanding our world and then hopefully discerning how God might be calling us to act in it. Certainly reading old books and talking to our neighbors is not going to magically resolve all the problems with the media. But I want to suggest that activities like these will at least help us better understand and tend to the world in which God has placed us. They might actually help us to love our neighbor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bilbro. I'm assuming that raised some questions from someone in the audience. So as you're thinking about that, I just want to thank you for sharing. This was from someone who has read and thoroughly enjoyed the book that's on the back table there. This was a selection from one of the main sections of the book. So there's tons more material. Every section is worth a very thorough reading. But any questions that the talk raised in your minds?
I know you may have answered this in many different ways during your talk, but I'd like to get a sort of a summation of your view of the constructive role of media. How do you perceive it can work toward these goals of knowing our neighbor better?
Yeah, I do think there's a lot of good journalists out there trying to do good work, and many of them doing good work. I think the challenge is so many of the economic incentives lie against doing good work, because what gets clicks, what goes viral is often more superficial or sort of clickbaity rather than nuanced and slow and thoughtful. And then I think I mentioned this briefly, but two, it's just easier, more profitable to focus your resources on national or international issues rather than local journalism. So a lot of people have been writing about and worried about the decline of good local journalism. So those are, I guess, my depressing things. I will say, though, I'm encouraged. There's a lot, I don't know what it looks like in your community where you are there, but there's a lot of, I think, kind of new, innovative structures for local journalism that are popping up and people are experimenting with. Sometimes it's like Substack or online website that's geared toward a community that often has sort of citizen journalists helping out because it's hard to get revenue to pay good full-time journalists. So I think there are good organizations. I could list some in politics or some in culture that are trying to do more thoughtful, slow, long-form reporting. But I think it depends kind of on what you're interested in, what you want, what you think you might be called to attend to, as to which of those maybe more niche or specialty type outlets are worth your attention. Yeah, so I mean, I think there are sort of signs of hope, and maybe our job as consumers is to seek out and patronize the journalists and the organizations that are trying to foster more healthy kinds of attention.
Yes, Art.
If you're encouraging us not to be just spectators for international, national issues, but we're not getting involved, is the alternative then to go to a meeting trying to stand up, for example, for good literature among a whole bunch of people who are trying to pull books off the library shelves, which is likely to be more frustrating, and you look at this and you say, is this really making any difference at all when there's so many more important things going on?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm under no illusions. I've been to my share of township meetings or local meetings. I'm under no illusion that those are places of goodwill and productive dialogue. I mean, they can be nasty, right? And I think tragically, oftentimes, not exclusively, but oftentimes, some of the reasons why those meetings are so tense is because of the broader political landscape, right? I mean, I think you talk about the library discussions. Those are tough questions about which books should be in libraries or how to, but it doesn't become helpful when there's sort of polarized national discourse that is inflaming those debates at a local level. I think too about, church meetings I was in during COVID, where local churches are trying to figure out what guidelines make sense for our parish, our congregation. But then the sort of national polarized discourse really ramps up the pressure, and it makes it harder for people who are trying to work together to do so. So I recognize the difficulties, but I do think those are still worthy conversations to be in. If we can be voices of understanding and sanity and charity in those contexts, then I think we have a real opportunity to change the debates in our local church meetings or local school board meetings in ways that you're not going to change them on a national level. But it's hard, absolutely.
Not so much a question as much as a comment or two. The first is things aren't as close as they appear is a wonderful thing to think about, the mirror analogy that you gave us earlier, and I thank you for that. The second is related to, I guess, your discipline of not watching television. And in a way, what you're saying is disassociate. Don't get so involved. And if that's the counsel, then that means that we have time on our hands. And in having time on our hands, it would say to me that that's an opportunity to be more involved in our community. For example, I think of Trinity-by-the-Cove as being a community. And it's a very strong reason for why Lucy and I actually are here in Naples. It's because of this community. So we don't have conversations that are essentially political. We have conversations that are caring. And so it puts a different twist on things. I could go on, but I don't want to get into a sermon here other than the fact that the gospel reading that we had this evening, Jesus deputized 70 people to go out 2 by 2, knocking on doors and giving the peace. And it was a very powerful message. And giving peace is an awful lot better than giving argument, shall we say.
Yeah.
That's it.
No, amen. Preach it. I think, yeah, I would concur. I would just maybe add one thing, which is, I think sometimes we feel like there's an obligation or sort of duty we have to be informed. But I think, as you were suggesting, sometimes that can be overwhelming and actually take us away from the opportunities we do have to be involved. And so oftentimes I think there's an inverse relationship between the quantity of information we consume and the quality of our contribution to the discourse or to others, right? That if we take in less, we might in fact have more to give. And even Jesus, he didn't have a cell phone, but he still withdrew to quiet places, in the dark to pray. So I think we need to recognize that sometimes the most loving act is to tune out the noise.
Hi, would you mind speaking on qualitative journalism in the face of AI, Julian Assange, historic social engineering through misinformation in media? Thank you.
It's a small question.
You have 1 minute.
Oh, okay, good.
I'm sorry.
No, I mean, yeah, I worry a lot about AI and the ways in which that is already just sort of amplifying noise and making people distrust everything they see online, right? So I think the kind of AI that we have right now, anyway, that seems most likely to be adopted right now, is not going to improve things, because it's just sort of noise built on noise, and I think it's only going to make these problems worse. So again, all the more need for embodied, real relationships and information with people that we can see face to face.
Thank you very much. We are at time, so I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight and for spending this time for us. A big thank you to Dr. Bilbro for spending this evening with us. He prefers to come in person, so he wishes he could be here, especially, I don't know what the weather is like up there in Pennsylvania right now, but probably a little nicer here. But we're glad that he was willing to fit us into his schedule this way. And for giving us a lot of helpful advice as to how to equip us to engage with the news media in ways that are more in line with our calling as Christians. I love just the idea of getting involved in the local community, being a part of your local community. Make this the center, as Ross said, make this the center of your way of looking at the world, the reality, the story that you hear that gives meaning to your life. And then go out and interact as a messenger of peace, as an ambassador of peace. For the regulars in the audience, next week we will not be meeting, so I don't want you to come and expect to be here. We're getting set up for a Christmas market. We will resume this Thursday meeting 2 weeks from today, so the November 21st, and we'll begin a new series then on the music of Advent with our very own Art Wink. I look forward to seeing you all there. Now, let's just close with a word of prayer. This is from our prayer book, The Collect for Those Who Influence Public Opinion. Let us pray. Almighty God, you proclaim your truth in every age by many voices. Direct in our time, we pray, those who speak where many listen and write what many read, that they may do their part in making the heart of this people wise, its mind sound, and its will righteous, to the honor of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Let us go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thank you again.
Thank you.